podcast.
They actually call out all aboard when you get on the train. Which, I don't know about you, but I find that just the most charming thing. So you could be stopped in the middle of the night, somewhere like Hornpain, just in the middle of nowhere, right? And you might have been on the train for the last 12 hours, 15 hours, depends on where you are on the stretch. And there'll be a scheduled stop. And it's interesting because it doesn't matter what time of day or night it is. If there's a scheduled stop, the train stops and the doors open and the people just make a mad exit. It's like on the New York subway when the train stops and the doors open and people just file out of it, you know. Because train life is very enclosed. I imagine you can picture that. Train life is very enclosed, can feel a little bit claustrophobic. And that's not to mean that train life isn't really cool and really novel. And it's not to mean that they don't make exquisite use of space on passenger trains, especially the overnight long distance passenger trains. The economy of space is absolutely remarkable. Now, I was on the Via Rail. I was on the Via train, went Toronto to Van and back. We'll talk about that in a minute. The way it works on those trains is that towards the back in the swell section, they have cabins back there that are unbelievable, and they are an unbelievable price as well. But I got the chance to poke my head in and take a look at one of these really swanky, really swell passenger cabins at the back of the train. The expensive ones, you know, the Elon Musk ones. And the way they use space in those cabins is incredible because it's not even as wide as a train, right? You've got to leave room for hallways, these 2-foot wide hallways. And the rest of that space, everything folds up and twists around. So you can pull your bed down and you've got yourself a nice little bedroom. And then the bed folds up into the wall. And chairs fold over and chairs swivel around and tables rise and fall. And the way they economize this space, if you're a geometry person, if you like puzzles, your dream job is to design these passenger cabins on a train because you have so little space to work with. And yet they do it beautifully, flawlessly, man. But train life is very enclosed. And so when you get a stop, and there are regularly scheduled stops to pick people up, to drop people off, to just simply let people off the train to breathe. When you land, when you stop, they open the doors and you might have 15 or 20 minutes where you can just go out and breathe, have yourself a cigarette, and then you got to get back on. They open the door and everybody gets out, right? And some people will just stretch. Some people will go for a little jog along the train. Some people will filter out into the streets around whatever train station you're at. Got to be a little bit careful with that. And you just enjoy this feeling of being released from the cabin, released from the train. And you may reach a certain point in your journey where, like Carly and me back in 2015, we'd been off and on the train for like 7 days over the course of a few weeks, right? Spent a lot of time on the train. And then coming home from that trip, Vancouver to Toronto, that's a 4-day straight shot, kids. This is what it's difficult to make people understand who do not live in Canada, who have not visited Canada. It's huge here, okay? Toronto to Van straight shot, Van to Toronto straight shot. That's 4 days aboard the train. And one of the things you need to do if you are Via, if you are any other passenger line, is you gotta entertain the people for 4 freaking days. Because at least back in 15, I don't know what it's like now, there was no cell phone, right? There was no Wi-Fi. There was no data access, right? Couldn't get a signal. Through a lot of the journey, you couldn't get a signal, right? And so people now who are slaves to the entertainment on their devices didn't, at least back then, have access to it. And I can't believe as I tell you this, that it's been long enough now since we did that trip that it was back then. What is the time frame on back then? You have a pandemic, it feels like anything more than about 3 years ago is back then. Pre-COVID, post-COVID. And so, no cell phone access. And you're talking about people being aboard this train for like 4 freaking days. And that is why you need entertainment. And that is why you've got something called the Artist on Board program. And I don't know if that still exists, but back in 2015, Heya had this thing called the Artist on Board program. And that is how Carly Thomas and I wound up riding the rails in that fateful summer of 2015. I began this by saying they actually say all aboard, and they do. So you get off the train at the stop. Let's say it's horn pain and it's the middle of the night and it's July and it's beautiful and it's stars. And you get off and you just stretch your legs a little bit. You breathe the air. You feel released from those very cleverly appointed cabins. And you just breathe. And that feels really, really good. And then they literally begin to shout, all aboard! And you feel like it's 1847. That, for me, as a history person, is just a really super cool feeling. All aboard! And you get back on the train. And you go back to whatever it was you were doing. It's an interesting thing, and I don't know how well people would deal with it now, to not have internet access for those long, long stretches of time. I mean, some people I'm pretty sure would get pretty fidgety about that. But they make entertainment available. I did a lot of reading, right? I read through Motley Crue's The Dirt, which was a fabulous read, actually, 100 times better than the Netflix movie. The actual book, way, way better, and really worth a read if you're curious about life as Motley Crue back in the 80s, because it was a thrill ride. And not always a happy one, by the way. But they need entertainment, especially on those long-haul train rides, right? No internet access, not a lot you can do. They have see-through cars. They have like the glass top cars, the observation cars. There'd be several of them spaced throughout the train, and those are really cool. I mean, you can go up there and you can just sit and watch the country go by, and that is fundamentally what you do a train ride like that for, right? It was a dream of mine for a long time to see the country via rail. I just thought that was a romantic thing to do. And then music delivered that to me via the Artist on Board program. Okay, now one of the things they do is they have entertainment cars along the train, right? And in there you might find board games and stuff you can do. And one of the things that they came up with, which is a really great idea, is this Artist on Board thing. And so what happens is if you are any sort of a performer, or if you do workshops, you might do writing workshops or poetry or painting. If you are a musician, you can apply for this Artist on Board program. And if you get accepted, what you do is you deliver your workshop, or in our case, you perform 3 times a day and you ride the rails for free. Now, Carly got wind of this. Ken the Zen and Sarah did it. We heard of other people who did it. Carly applied for it. She was allowed to take a +1 as an accompaniment. That was me as her backup singer and percussion player. And the notion we had in our head was, let's go out west and tour. One of the expensive things is, how do we get out there and tour? And riding the rails for free was the way to do that. But it's not an easy business, man. You've got to perform 3 times a day aboard that train. So you do work for it. And train life is very, very interesting. And going back again to people who have never visited Canada, people who have never really conceptually understood the hugeness of this country. This is why you need the entertainment. You get on the train in Toronto in T-Dot, and you set sail, and you go to sleep, whatever. 20 hours later, you're still in Ontario. 20 hours later, you wake up and you look out your window, and it's nothing but lakes and trees and rocks, the Canadian Shield. You're in Northern Ontario. You have not left your province yet. You've barely left your freaking area code. You've been on the train for 20 hours. I can't really make that understood to people, especially my European listeners, for whom 5 or 6 hours on a train lands you in any one of a dozen major capitals that are around you. 20 hours, you haven't left your area code. 20 hours, you have not come yet upon another major city. That's a huge frigging country. And you got 3 days to go after that. And so you need the entertainment. And that is why they started this program. And it's a really great program. And I hope it still exists. I don't know. The pandemic cut the legs out of so much of everything. So I don't know what Heya offers now. But we applied for and we got this. And that is how we wound up in Kelowna. Last week on the program, I talked about, with reference to the band Freeze the Fall from Kelowna, British Columbia, I talked about a gig that we played out there on that tour, right? And that was a gig at some joint in Kelowna, some restaurant that had told us they have a PA. And we got there, and their PA was literally a microphone plugged into the wall that could technically be used to publicly address the patrons, maybe the kitchen staff of that restaurant. But for performance purposes, not a PA. And I list that in my memory as a good old-fashioned chicken wire gig. Chicken wire being a reference to the scene in the original Roadhouse, where the Jeff Healey band is playing behind a chicken wire fence, basically, on the stage to protect it from the mayhem. And my good friend Ann Menez gave me the term chicken wire to describe any sort of a gig that's just off the freaking rails, man. And you run into them all the time, especially as an indie artist on the road. For me, that gig in Kelowna, just a fun chicken wire thing, but it was, and I had forgotten this until very recently, something much more poignant, something much more profound for Carly. And that's what we're going to talk about today, kids. Not to put words in Carly's mouth, of course, but she just has a way more compelling and uplifting take on that gig than I do. But you've got to understand, I think, the context of it before we get to the profundity. Now, we got on board the train in Toronto. We rode 3 days across the country to Edmontonia, and 3 times a day performing on that train. And trains are laid out in a very compelling way. These long haul passenger trains. At the back, you got the swells, all right? You got the champagne car is the very last car. That's the bar, kids. And if you are a musician, you are most welcome there. At the back, you got the champagne car, and I'm not sure everybody has access to that, but the musicians sure do. Then there's a series of, I don't know if it's maybe a couple of cars of the really swanky swell, like 10 grand probably, sleeper cabins that are little apartments on wheels. Extraordinary what they can cram into that space and make it feel open, make it feel comfortable. So you get a series of those, and then in front of that, there's kind of the middle class. There's the first world at the back, there's the second world in the middle, where Carly and I, for example, on the way out there, had a sleeper car, or it slept 2. Bunk beds, a sink, a toilet, things that fold up, and then you could turn that into a sitting room if you folded everything up into where it goes. Look out your window, read the dirt. And that was cool. And then in front of that, there will be berths that are single person berths. And again, it's a bed that folds down. There's a door you shut and you lock. There's a big window with a screen. And I've said before on the show, one of the great profound spiritual moments I had was on the way back from Van in the middle of the night, just looking out my window at nothing but stars, right? No light pollution whatsoever going across the prairies. And I was listening to Beth Rest by Bon Iver, which for me, that's a love it or hate it song. I love it. I was listening to the live version from Austin City Limits. For me, a very emotional, very evocative song. Very spiritual kind of song. And I'm looking out at just nothing but millions of stars, right? Those of us who live in cities don't have concept of what stars actually are. Now, we see a few dots in the sky and we feel like that's profound. And it is. But you see stars with no light pollution and it's unreal. It's just this canopy, millions of stars. I'm looking out at that. I'm feeling the bigness of the universe, the tininess of my own little existence within it. Listening to this song, just having a moment. And it was on the way back from what was an odyssey of a 6-week tour out there. Really profound. And so you have your individual cabins. And then in front of that, there are like berths. And I don't know if the berths are like just simply overnight compartments, but there's a bunk and a big heavy curtain that you can close over it. And that's about it. All right. That is not a 4-day thing. I don't think. Maybe it is. Wouldn't be super comfortable. And then in front of that is kind of a jungle, man. In front of that, there will be X number of cars of just seats. And you go up there, and it's just families with areas staked out, right? Like the perimeter is set out. This is our space. These are our seats. And there'll be people like slumped there. People stretched out sleeping, kids upside down, and it's like a camp up there. And I'll tell you, we had many of our most fun gigs playing up there in the jungle because the people were just more raucous. The people were desperate for entertainment and something to do. I mean, there's a lot of families up there with kids, and the kids are bored despite the entertainment cars, despite the wonderful scenery out the window. A lot of times those people up there are having a much different experience of the train ride than the people in the swell cars at the back, you know? And isn't that just life? Isn't the train a micro of the macro? So we ride out there and we've got to play 3 times a day. Usually we would start at the back end in the entertainment car back there. Then we would move up to the middle to the entertainment car there. And then up to the front to the entertainment car there. And it was always fun, but always weird. All right. I'm playing my lap cajon, sits on my lap, and you're walking. Carly's got a guitar. I got my cajon, and the corridors on a train are not wide, man. I'm banging my elbows. You're waiting for people. You see somebody coming from the other end. You have to wait for them to get to you before you can go. There's this weird kind of traffic etiquette that begins to develop. And you might have to walk up 10 cars to get to wherever it is you're going. These trains are long, man. Like we logged some steps. And then you get up there and you set up and you play. And there would be people in the car because, again, they're looking for something to do. They're on this train for 4 days, some of them. No Wi-Fi access. And you would play and they would be appreciative. And then you'd get up to the front and it would be just chaos up there. There'd be 20 kids in the cabin and they're trying to grab your guitar. Really, really interesting gigs, man, but not always exotic. I can remember distinctly sitting on the floor in the train station in Winnipeg, literally sitting on the floor with the cajon in my lap while we played. You know, we were obligated to play in some of the stations during the stopovers, and that was just part of the deal, man. And 100% worth it. 100% worth it to have this very novel experience of seeing the country via train. It was really, really cool. And I got to tell you, man, the food on board those trains, absolutely outstanding. All right. If you ever get the opportunity, have the wherewithal to do a train across the country, it is really breathtaking, really profound. It is an amazing way to see this country. So we took the train like 3 days out to Edmontonia. We jumped off. Then we did 10 gigs, I think, around Alberta. And we rented a vehicle, we rented drums. I think we probably rented an amp and just did for a couple of weeks the tour grind, man, the traditional tour grind. And it can be a grind, okay? Some good shows, some bad shows. One night we're playing in Olds, Alberta at this bar out there, and there's people, and that was the first show. We had a pretty good show. It was still great. The energy was still high, right? The next night, we're in some little coffee shop outside of Edmonton. There's nobody there. I think we started with 3 people, and then we were down to 2. And it's like, I don't know, do we finish this gig or not? There's nobody here. And it was this kind of odyssey, and we ran into some really great situations, some really tough situations. We played a gig in Lloydminster, right on the edge, right on the border of Saskatchewan and Alberta. It might actually straddle that border. And it was like a 7-hour drive to get there from Calgary. And this giant room, like it was a restaurant/venue, this huge sound system that nobody could make work. Rumor has it, the dude who was in charge of doing sound at that venue had been released from duties the week before, and as a parting gift, as a little farewell, had junked the entire sound system on the way out. And so for the life of us, we could not get this thing to go. We had set up the drums, we had set up Carly's guitar situation. We were getting ready to play this gig to an empty room because, unbeknownst to us, there was some sort of festival happening in Lloydminster that day. It was like a Friday night or a Saturday night. The whole damn town was downtown to watch fireworks and stuff. So there were 4 or 5 people, maybe 6 people in this giant restaurant. We're trying to set up to play one of these gigs, and nobody can make the sound system go. And it's just one of those chicken wire things. You run into this, and it's like, what do you do? We've driven 7 freaking hours to get here. Can't make the sound system work. And so Carly winds up sitting on the stage with her acoustic guitar, and maybe 5 people were sitting in front of her at a table, and I played along with my lap cajon, just like on the train. And it wound up being this really memorable kind of campfire gig. Memorable, but also a difficult gig. We've driven 7 hours to be here. We're tired. The stuff doesn't work. There's nobody here. You make the best of it in those situations. And then that night, we had a hotel room as part of the gig, which was connected to the venue. And the fire alarm keeps going off. I don't know how many times in the middle of the night the freaking fire alarm went off. And so you get up and you go and you see what's going on. So not a lot of sleep. A gig that was memorable and charming in retrospect, but at the time felt very deflating. And then turn around and drive 7 hours all the way back to Calgary, right? Get on to the next thing, and we played a couple of rooms that were small and mostly empty, or people weren't listening, and that's just life, right? That's just life as an indie artist out of market. It's very, very difficult at times to pull people out of market. And you accept that as part of the challenge when you go out and do these tours, right? And so we did, I think, 10 shows in Alberta. Some of them were really good. I can remember we were in Banff, and that's when the Travelers showed up. I think it's politically incorrect to say gypsies anymore, but fundamentally, we were again playing this really big club, and I think it was Banff. Nobody there really, or, a few people kind of over in the corner not really paying attention. We're playing our set, okay. And then, all of a sudden, the dance floor is just full of whirling dervishes. These Traveler people, and they're all over British Columbia. The culture kind of lends itself. They leak into Banff, and there's a lot of Travelers out there in that part of the world. And suddenly they're just whirling around the dance floor. A bunch of them. Yay! And we had this kind of 15 or 20 minutes of kind of an exuberance, and then whoosh, they were gone again. A memorable night, We hiked in the mountains of Jasper and very nearly came face to face with an enormous brown bear that we eventually saw as we were driving out. And also a gaggle of Australians, and I don't know which is more beautiful or more terrible, a brown bear or a gaggle of Australians. And one night, a temporary member of the entourage, regaled us by lighting farts in the band house. So, we had some very intense cultural experience. Some really good times, some really rough times, And then we got back to Calgary. We had our car rented, and then we drove over the mountains, through the mountains. And wow, dude, if you have not been to the Canadian Rockies, get thee out there pronto. Rent a car, mortgage your house, and rent a car, because I think that's what you have to do now. And just driving through the mountains was unreal, man. I come from Ontario, okay? That's flat earth. It's very flat here. We have quote unquote ski hills that you just kind of walk up and ski back down. You know what I mean? 100% capital M mountains. And you're driving along and you see a mountain in front of you and you're like, well, it can't possibly get better than that. And then the highway turns and you go around a corner and there's a better one. And then a better one, and then a better one. It's just incredible. And so we're having these amazing highs, right? And it brings to mind memories of going through the mountains again with Sarah a few years after that. And we were in like a 1985 minivan of some sort that wound up for that leg of the tour being our tour vehicle. And that's a dicey prospect going down one of those hills, man. Going down one of those mountains that have like the runaway lanes. So if you're a transport truck and you're out of control, you can veer off the highway going down the mountain off into this runaway lane, which is usually just like a dirt track. And it's a dirt track that goes kind of uphill and you just kind of coast to stopping again rather than going out of control coming down the mountain. And I could smell the brakes on this van as I was driving it as we were going downhill. And you think, I don't know if we're going to survive this, man. I don't even know if the runaway lane's going to save us if the brakes fail entirely. And that's being out there on the road, and it's freaking great, man. So we drove in and we eventually landed in Vancouver, and we had another couple weeks, another 10 or so shows set up around British Columbia. And so we went over to Vancouver Island. We played some shows in Victoria. We kind of toured around the island a bit, saw the redwood trees, had that amazing island experience. And it's wonderful out there. I really love the air. I love the vibe in BC. And being on the ocean in Victoria and just watching like U.S. naval ships go by, this kind of thing. Very charming. But again, some difficult shows. Some shows that maybe weren't that well attended, or some gigs in places that, just being an indie artist, sometimes the shows aren't great. We had some really good shows. We played a couple gigs in Vancouver. Carly has a history in Vancouver, and so people came out to that. And those were, I think, encouraging for her. Some of it was tough. We played a gig in Hope, British Columbia. Hope, BC, famous for, that's where they shot First Blood. So you go across that bridge, you picture Brian Dennehy, the whole thing. And we played an outdoor gig, part of this concert series that the city was having, at this really big band shell looking into this huge open park in Hope, British Columbia. There's two people standing in the park. One of whom was a high school friend of mine called Lisa, who I had not seen in a very long time. Thanks, Lisa, for coming. There's two people, and I didn't have a drum rug at that moment, and my bass drum kept sliding across the concrete stage. Rough gig, and over time, the road just catches up to you. You become fatigued, you become tired, you become a little bit jaded, even though you're having this experience of doing it. We're on the road. We're out here doing 6 weeks of shows, and we booked it ourselves and we're doing it. And there's that kind of high feeling of being in the game, but then also just the wear and tear, the fatigue, some of the gigs that were not so good, sitting on the floor in a train station. You know what I mean? Some of it catches up to you. And we were maybe 5 weeks into a 6-week tour when we finally landed in Kelowna for this gig where they said they had a PA, and they didn't have a PA. They didn't have a PA. And we get in there, And it just becomes very easy at that point in a tour, when the road miles have caught up to you, when the fatigue has caught up to you, when all of the driving, all of the train riding, some of the really difficult gigs, when it all just begins to catch up to you, right? And so you walk into a venue like that, and I sometimes feel conspicuous in a restaurant venue anyways. You know what I mean? Like, people have come to have dinner and a drink or whatever. Some of them perhaps not expecting there to be live music. Now, most people are generally appreciative of that. Some people aren't. You can feel a little bit conspicuous, but it becomes even worse when you realize there's no sound system and it's turning into a chicken wire gig. And what do you do, right? What we did was what professionals have to do, is that you make it work. And so it was another Lloydminster situation, all right? No sound system. What's the best we can do? So we set up to play acoustically, to be heard as best we could for this table that was in front of us, or we could angle ourselves or move ourselves toward another table. And it's mentally tough. It's mentally deflating to find yourself in those circumstances and playing and not even really being able to be heard above all of the people in the restaurant chatting and having a good time and not paying the slightest attention to you. And it's very easy in those circumstances to become really existential about it, right? Like, what are we doing? Like, what are we doing? I know we're on the road and I know we're trying our best, but it's not supposed to be like this. It's not supposed to be where this sort of conspicuous inconvenience, playing like a campfire in front of a couple of tables that maybe aren't even all that interested in what we're doing. And early on in the tour, I think you have more endurance for that sort of thing. But by the end of a tour, 5 weeks into 6 weeks, a lot of it is just accumulated on you, right? Like a little bit of a crust. And so I think I'm putting words, I don't mean to put words in Carly's mouth, but very recently I watched her at a gig and she retold the story and I'd forgotten about it. And we'll talk about that in a minute. For me, just another chicken wire gig. For her, I think she was feeling somewhat existential about it all because her name's on the poster, man. Her picture is on the poster on the door, man. It's her who's associated with this chicken wire thing. And you begin to think about, is it worth it, what we're doing here? This is not the sort of gig we want to be playing. And then you begin to look at the last 5 weeks by that point in context. It's like, the financial compensation hasn't been great. You know, we're struggling probably to break even here. The experiential compensation has been mostly really good, but you look at the finances, it's like, has this been worth it? Now we're in this position where my name's on the poster and we're in a deflating, maybe even embarrassing situation. And then if you're like me, very quickly, that becomes a huge, big picture existential problem, right? What am I doing with my life? What am I doing right now? This doesn't work. This isn't working. I'm not working. And it's very easy to feel like a complete failure. It's very easy to feel like a complete joke under a circumstance like that, especially when your endurance has been somewhat worn away by 5 weeks of the road, man. The road grind, okay? It is an endurance sport. The road demands a lot of you, particularly at that level where you're doing your own driving and you're playing small gigs that perhaps aren't that well compensated. And a lot of times there's nobody there. And you drove 7 hours to Lloydminster and the sound system didn't work. And then you had to drive 7 hours back home. And then you got to Kelowna and you're in this chicken wire situation. You begin to look at all of that and tally it up and think, it's just a waste of time. It's never going to work. You know, it's very easy to get into that kind of existential headspace. And I'm not saying that Carly got there, but as she told us at the Mockingbird in L-Town last Thursday night, as she talked about that gig from the stage, that, you know, she was, if nothing else, perhaps at a bit of low ebb just with the entire circumstance, right? Again, it's her name on the freaking poster, right? It's her brand. It's her identity that's associated with all of this, right? So we saw her at the Mockingbird last Thursday. My spouse or significant other and I went to check it out. The Mockingbird is another one of these speakeasies. A few weeks ago, I did an episode about having gone to a speakeasy. That's a thing right now. Apparently, the show Mad Men may have inspired all of that. And then the COVID pandemic actually really blossomed this idea because we weren't allowed to gather, right? And then all of a sudden, the speakeasy became like it was in the 20s, like this kind of clandestine thing that we're hiding from the government. It got, during the pandemic, this sort of a veneer on it, like we're flouting the law here. It's kind of a throwback to 100 years earlier, which is kind of cool. Mockingbird is another one of these, although it's expanded from its tiny room. I think speakeasies have to be kind of a tiny room, only holds maybe less than 20 people. It's expanded now. It's occupied some of the other space around it. It's turning into more of a mainstream kind of bar, but it's a really, really cool space. And they've got a room now where a solo person can perform, and they actually have a PA that works. So we went to see Carly play and to check out the Mockingbird, have an old-fashioned. And she did great, of course, but at a certain point, she played the song Heya. All right, and this is where the ties are. This is where the throwback happens. Because in setting up playing the song Heya by Outkast, she talked about this gig in Kelowna. And I referenced this on last week's podcast. She hadn't even listened to it yet. It was a synchronicity. She's talking about this gig that I had referenced on the podcast. And she talked about some of the circumstances just like I did. Now, she did it like a pro in 30 seconds, not half an hour like me. But she talked about having to face this audience under those circumstances. And we played Heya. We were doing it back then because it's a crowd pleaser, man. It gets people singing. That chorus is very memorable. People know it. And if you are an indie artist playing mostly your own songs, once in a while, you drop in a cover to just engage the audience, and we did that song. We did it Carlified, but everybody recognizes it. And she talked about that moment in Kelowna when we played that song. We were set up. It was her, it was me. Our friend Pat had joined us for some of the BC shows, so it was three of us against the world. And she sings the first verse of Heya, and then when you come into the chorus the way we do it, it turns into this big 3-part harmony, right? And for her, she remembers this moment when she's singing this song to an audience of people probably not listening under these heinous circumstances, 5 weeks in and covered in road grit, and just feeling really kind of down about it. And she comes into that chorus, and then all of a sudden, there's a swell of voices that join her, right? It was Pat and me singing our 3-part harmonies. And for her, it was this profound moment of realizing that, again, not to put words in her mouth, but realizing that she was not alone here, that she had people with her who were supporting her, that she had people with her who were willing to walk through that fire with her. This surge of voices symbolized that she was not alone. And for her, that was a cockle-warming moment, realizing that as difficult as these circumstances can be, she had people who had her back, and that was Pat and me. And I have come to realize throughout the last 10 years of being a side player that that's part of your job. It's part of your job as a side player to pick your artist up under those circumstances, right? It's part of your job to bring it and to bring the energy and to bring the support every night on freaking stage. And there are times, I mean, just as a baseline, as a professional, that's what you need to do. But then if you're going above and beyond, it's recognizing these moments when your artist might be flagging just a little bit and to bring even more to it in those moments. To bring a smile, to bring the energy, to bring something that says, let's go, to say, we got this, we got you. And it's very, very important as a side player to be hip to that and to do it. And I have not always been great at that, all right? There have been moments when I too have faltered. There have been moments when I too have failed in that responsibility, at least a little bit. And that's just being human, but being a pro means being there. And to be honest, to be fair, as an artist, you need to be the sort of artist that your band wants to pick up that way. Right? Professionals are going to do it under any circumstances, but if you're an artist who is not bringing it to, you're probably going to lose your professionals. That's just an aside. In that moment, Carly felt this surge of support around her. And her memory of that Kelowna gig is something much more poignant and much more profound than mine. For me, just a chicken wire gig, but for her, a really heartwarming moment of feeling like there were people with her who had her back, and that was her band. And I think that's important for an artist to realize too. Just the level to which people are actually willing to sacrifice for you, the level to which people are really willing to be in it with you and to be in those circumstances and to play their hearts out and to sing their hearts out and to support your thing, And I hope artists recognize and appreciate that and realize that. Carly does. Carly did. And she just reminded us of that on Thursday night. And so she was getting ready to play Heya, and I'm in the audience. I'm sitting right in front of her. She tells that story. She talks about me and Pat. And then she invites me to come up on stage with her and to do the backup vocals on Heya. And so we recreated that moment up to a point. It's hard to believe it's almost 10 years ago. But it was fun. It was fun to relive that moment. And it's fun in retrospect to relive some moments of that tour. I learned so much about being a side player on that tour. You learn lessons, and sometimes you learn hard lessons, man. I learned them, but they are lessons that every side player's got to learn about doing the job right and about doing the job well and what the priorities are and where your commitment sits. I mean, there were so many things that I needed to learn and did learn on that tour, sometimes the hard way. But it's really interesting for me to recognize how two people can have such profoundly different memories of a shared experience, and it makes me think about something that I realized recently about living in the present, all right? A lot of people pay lip service to living in the present. That's a very spiritual thing to do. It's a very popular thing to say these days, but I had never really understood what that meant beyond academically until very recently. I had this moment very recently where the big picture is very much full of question marks. The big picture of my employment, my income, music, this podcast. I mean, there are a lot of things that in the big picture are pretty shaky, right? A lot of things that are actually pretty stressful, pretty anxiety producing. And the thing about anxiety is that the anxiety is always future focused, right? You're always worried about something that may or may not happen. And you live not in this present moment, but in that future with all the questions unanswered. Depression tends to be backward facing in a lot of cases. Like I did this wrong or that didn't work out or whatever. You tend to live in a past. Anxiety lives in a future. Depression tends to live in a past, but not in the present moment. And the thing about the present moment is that in a lot of cases, 90% of the time, maybe higher, the present moment is just fine, right? The anxiety you feel, the depression you feel is you vaulting yourself into the future or into the past without being in what isn't actually usually just fine present. And so I had this moment a couple weeks ago where I was working on a freelance assignment that is relatively lucrative. All right. One of my issues has been income. All of a sudden, I've got this assignment that's going to provide some. And I had just recorded a podcast episode that I thought was pretty good. And, I have issues trying to get people to listen to this program, trying to get it to grow. I struggle with whether I'm even any freaking good at it. But I had just done an episode that was okay. And so on this temporary moment, it was good. And I had at that point some recording coming up on the weekend. I was getting ready to play a gig with Fresh Breath. And so music is a huge question mark for the future. But in this moment, everything that I wanted was in place. I had a job I was doing that was going to pay me. I had a podcast episode that I thought worked, and I had gigs and recording coming up. All right. In that moment, micro, small picture, everything was A-okay. And I realized it was profound. I realized that is living in the present. That is living in the present, recognizing that in this present moment, the big picture stuff might be stress or anxiety inducing, but it's all just fine here right now. And I think Carly had a similar realization in that moment in Kelowna when those voices joined her on that chorus, and she realized big picture stuff might not be great, but here right now in this moment, I am performing music in a venue, and I got people who support me. I got people who have my back, and I can worry about the big picture later. And this question comes up where if you can recognize that all is okay in the present, in this present moment, can those moments collectively lead to everything being okay in the big picture, right? Can you take it moment by moment? It's okay, it's okay, it's okay. And have that energy and that optimism create the circumstances that you want. All right. That is esoteric. That is manifesty. That is secrety. But if you listen to people who operate in that world, that's what they talk about. That's what this vibration thing is. Having a high vibration attracts high vibration results, right? And so if you're walking around always in this state of anxiety about the future, you attract an anxiety-ridden future. Whereas if you can be in this present moment and realize that big picture, everything's not perfect, but everything in this moment is okay, does that attract the kind of energy? Does that create the kind of vibration that continues to create moments of everything being okay? Can these moments of realizing things are okay combine to create the future that you want? You know, I know that's an esoteric concept, but it's really something profound to think about. And I began to understand living in the present. That's what it is. It doesn't mean you don't want to change things. It doesn't mean you don't want to grow. It doesn't mean you don't have dreams or goals or ambition, but stressing about them isn't usually conducive to making them come true. Whereas recognizing things are okay in this moment can lead to more moments of things being okay and eventually a life that's okay. Maybe. This has gone way longer than I intended it to. Let's quickly do the Patreon plug. Folks, there is a Patreon page for this podcast. Patreon.com/John Huff Podcast. I have one tier of membership. It is $5 a month. It is you saying to me, hey, Jack, I enjoy this program. I enjoy the work you're doing. I would like to support you in this way because it does cost me money to do it. It does cost me time to do it. And I do not want to compensate for that with ads. You know by now how much it drives me crazy to have to sit through 5 minutes of freaking ads at the beginning of a podcast and have to stop every 10 minutes to take another ad break. It drives me freaking crazy. It turns it into AM radio. I don't want to do that. I started the Patreon, okay? So if you are being informed, entertained, educated, learning about new music, if you just enjoy having a friendly voice in your ear holes, please think about supporting me on Patreon. I mean, it's the way that I'm going to be able to keep doing this. It's simply put, Patreon, $5 a month. Think of it as tipping me $1.25 for every episode I do. If you think to yourself, what I've just listened to is worth $1.25 to me, less than the price of a cup of coffee, please consider supporting me at patreon.com/John Huff Podcast. I have merch, john-huff.com/shop, t-shirts, mugs, etc. Word of mouth, kids, still the best advertising. So if nothing else, please consider sharing the episode teasers I put out. Please consider telling a friend. You know, somebody who likes podcasts might enjoy, might get something from this one. Please just consider, do that too if you like. Please just consider telling your friends that this podcast exists. I want to thank everybody for your support so far. Patrons, reviews, people who have left reviews and ratings. That Really, really makes me feel good when I see that. Haven't seen a review in a long time, would appreciate a new one. And preferably a 5-star review. Thank you ever so kindly for your support. Lo, these 5 years and 191 episodes. Really, really, really quickly. Quicker than I intended. This week's musical recommendation is the new single by Sebastian Bach. Better known to most of you as Sebastian Bach, the original voice of Skid Row. Let's not open up that can of worms. Sebastian Bach has a new single, and it's appropriate. It fits with the theme of the episode. Hold on to the dream. Gotta tell you, really like this. I think Skid Row is one of the underrated bands of all time, probably. I know that sounds weird to you because they were a platinum-selling band, but go back and listen to those records, the first 3. Just check out some of the lyrics on those songs, man, especially in the context of the hair/glam metal world. Really heavy stuff, man. Really profound stuff. Skid Row does not get the credit it deserves for its lyrical content, and I think they were a really, really fabulous band, and part of the reason is Sebastian Bach's vocals. I think he is one of the great rock singers of all time. And I will put him up against pretty much anybody, kids. He's gotten older, okay? I know he's taken some heat. He's taken some stick about his voice not being what it was live. Take that or leave it as you wish. In the studio, Sebastian Bach still sounds like Sebastian freaking Bach, okay? And so he does on this song, Hold On to the Dream. He sounds freaking great. Live is a different animal, man. You're jumping around. Your energy is up. It takes quite a lot of stamina, breath support, endurance. Maybe some of the live clips you see are shot from the end of a show. You know, maybe he saves I Remember You for the encore. He's been playing and singing for an hour and a half. His voice is burning out. Maybe he's a little bit tired. I'm just saying, live is a different animal. And I'm pretty sure he had his nose broken too. And I think that will affect the tone of your voice and your breathing. That will affect things. But in the studio, when he can take his time, when he can be well rested, well hydrated, when he can do multiple takes, he sounds freaking great. And I really like this song, Hold On to the Dream. Starts as kind of a ballad, then just turns into a lip-curling, sneering rock song. You know, in terms of the Skid Row pantheon, sounds a little bit maybe like Monkey Business on those verses. Really cool. The lyrics are cool, but the way the lyrics are delivered, the rhythm of the lyrics on those verses, there's a chugging guitar underneath them. It's heavy. He's crushing it. It's lip curling. All right. I've talked about in the past songs where you hear them and your lip just has to curl, right? You got to do drummer faces. You got to do guitar faces when you just dig in to a riff and a rhythm that does that to you. This song does that. You know, this is not a throwaway cookie cutter hair metal song, glam rock song from 1990. This is very modern sounding, and he's crushing it. All right, Sebastian Bach is crushing it on this song. It's coming. There's a new album coming out, Child Within the Man, and I'm not sure when. A really fun Easter egg for Skid Row fans. In the video, at least for this song, Rob Affuso is playing drums. The drummer from Skid Row back in the heyday. Fun to see those two together again. And I'm shouting it out, man. I'm shouting out Hold On to the Dream by Sebastian Bach. I think his new record's going to be really cool. I've heard a few songs, and he's crushing it, man. He's at least crushing it in the studio. I can't speak for live. I've not seen him live. I've seen some clips, but again, you don't really know the context of those clips. And good for Boss, I say. Dude is, whether you understand this or not, dude is a rock freaking legend. Dude is a rock icon. And I know some of you younger than me, for whatever reason, the music of that entire era is just excluded from the airwaves. And so you don't understand, some of you, that Skid Row was one of the biggest bands on planet freaking Earth. That dude, Sebastian Bach, and everybody else in that band is a freaking rock legend, okay? Still bringing it. He's 60 now, whatever he is, and he's still crushing it. And I dig this song. It is my selection of the week. It's going to take me far longer than I want to edit this. And so I have to go. Thank you ever so kindly for listening. I will shutting up, except to say, hey kids, Good things happen when you put yourself on a train. And hey, I'll check you later. Yeah.